We're pleased to begin today's virtual forum with a presentation that aims to set the foundation for our discussions and pave the way for the topics we'll be exploring. I'm honored to introduce our first presenter, Janice Makokis. Janice Makokis is an Indigenous legal scholar, an advocate for Indigenous rights, and a treaty educator. Janice currently serves as assistant professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Windsor. You may find Janice's bio in the forum program on page 6. Janice's presentation, Restoring the Balance, Indigenous Understandings of Restorative Justice, will explore Indigenous practices, laws, philosophies, and worldviews, offering a deeper understanding of restorative justice from an Indigenous perspective. Janice, welcome. Thank you for being here today. I'll now turn it over to you to begin. Thank you, Janice.
Thank you, Margarita, for the warm welcome. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody, wherever you are joining from. I just want to introduce myself in my language to just set the tone and remind myself of who I am, who I'm accountable to, and the lands and territories that I'm on. Wapamasquasis Netsikasan Nehiawisquonia Onyx Gabonik Otinia. So in my language, I just said my name, my Cree name is Little White Bear. The clan that I belong to is the Bear Clan. I'm Nihio or Cree from the Satellite Cree Nation, which is located 2 hours northeast of Edmonton. And I'm joining you today from Amiskwaci Waskaikan, otherwise known as Edmonton, in what we now refer to as Alberta in Treaty 6. It's a pleasure and an honor to be able to speak to you today about such an important topic. And I want to acknowledge all the people that have joined from coast to coast to coast and even other countries as I'm looking in the chat. The work that you all do to address violence in the community, gender-based violence, using whether it's restorative justice practice, alternative justice practice, it's incredibly important as we decolonize how we do the work that we do. And so my presentation to you today is a little bit about that. So I would refer to myself as a Cree law practitioner. I've spent the past 25 years trying to learn, revitalize, and understand Cree ways, Cree laws. And embedded within that, I would say, is inevitably a natural part of understanding and learning about this idea and concept that many refer to as restorative justice. So I'm going to just switch slides here. When I was thinking about what I was going to talk to you today about, my mind took me back to Indigenous laws and the original laws of our people. And what I'm going to share in this presentation specifically is about Cree laws, but I want people to know that every Indigenous nation across this country, from the West Coast to the prairies to the north to the East Coast, every Indigenous nation in this country has laws and very sophisticated set of laws and governance structures. And that is the foundation of where we derive our way of conducting ourselves, how we see the world, how we relate to each other. I also want to acknowledge the Learning Network for the incredible work that you've done to put together this forum. I want to acknowledge Elder Gloria for setting the tone and grounding us in a good way before we start the forum. That is how I do my work and the practice that I do. Um, I also want to acknowledge and thank NECA and Margarita for all the incredible conversations that we've had collectively over the past few months to help get us to this conference today. It was many of the pre conference conversations and preparatory meetings that we had together um, as women that helped stimulate ideas for what I want to share with you today. In fact, some of our first conversations, we were talking about the origins of restorative justice and talking about where did these ideas come from. And that's how I came up with the title for the presentation I'm going to share with you today. And if I can be so bold to say, I want to say that Indigenous peoples are experts in restorative justice because these practices have been embedded within our law and governance structures since time immemorial, so forever. It was only after um, settlers arrived on the shores, after we invited them, that there was a disruption to our way of life, which I'm going to speak to. So, this is the agenda that I've created for the next little bit for you, and I'm just going to get on with my presentation. Whenever I start my presentations, I always acknowledge the people that taught me. And most of what I'm going to share with you today is not found in any research, is not found in books, and that's because many of our laws and our governance structures, which are found in our ceremonies, on the land, in our how we practice our way of life, in our songs, those are not found in books. And so I've spent the past, I want to say 25 to 30 years learning from an incredible amount of elders, knowledge keepers to learn about some of the things that I'm going to share with you. And so I always acknowledge them when I do this work. I acknowledge that I've had the privilege to meet and learn from many of these people across Canada, and they've shaped my view on Indigenous issues and what we need to do to work together as Indigenous and non Indigenous peoples to create a better world for ourselves, our children, and the future generations of children that are counting on us to make good decisions for them to inherit the work we do here on Earth. Our Kiteyak, in Cree, we refer to them as Kiteyak, but they're elders or old people. We call them, we ask them to share knowledge with us, teachings and prophecy of how we are to live together in peace, harmony, and in good relations with one another, as we are all related and part of each other's families. So that's how I want to approach the presentation with you today. That at one point in our history, we all knew what our original instructions were when we came to live on Earth. Our original instructions were stripped away from us, and this contributed to a very violent colonial history and experience. And for those of you that do the work, you would see that in all of the increase of violence within families, intimate partner violence, all of those issues and statistics of occupying the criminal justice system is a direct result of the disruption that happened to our people. In Cree, in our practice of our relationships, like many other Indigenous kinship practices, when we greet each other, we are always asked, who are you and who is your family? So I'm going to practice this with you here today because this also keeps me accountable to what I've learned, who I am, where I'm from. And it's custom for us to share who our parents are, who our grandparents are, and sometimes our aunties and uncles, and then which nation, clan, and the lands that we come from. So I kind of already did that in my opening. So for today, I'm going to practice this because this is how we exercise our laws through our kinship relations. These are the people I am accountable to, and they also hold me reciprocally accountable when I overstep, when I break any laws, and when I go out of line. And this is part of the embedded, I would say, restorative justice practice and teachings and principles that are naturally part of our Indigenous laws and legal orders. So my parents are Eugene and Pat Makokis. On my dad's side of our family, we are from the Saddle Lake Cree Nation, which is 2 hours northeast of Edmonton. On my mom's side of the family, we are from the Kikino Métis settlement and the Goodfish Lake Cree Nation. My maternal grandparents were from Kikino and Goodfish. My paternal grandparents were from the Saddle Lake Cree Nation, and both were residential school survivors. I share this with you because they were all my first teachers. They were the ones that raised me and taught me about what it means to be Cree and to live a Cree way of life. And I would also suggest where the origins and the beginnings of where I began to understand what restorative justice is. But to put simply, we never refer to it as restorative justice. We refer to it as our way of life. And this is just us practicing our way of life. This presentation is as much about the origins of what I will call Indigenous justice and restorative justice as it is about revitalizing our laws and governance structures. We can't talk about one without the other, they are intertwined. Over 20 years ago, I was a curious undergrad and graduate student. As I came to learn about colonialism and colonial impacts, the theme that kept coming into my mind was, where are the women? What happened to the women? What role did Indigenous women have in our families, our nations, and our governance? There was little research and literature at the time, and so this set me on a path to discover answers to these questions. I would meet powerful women who did incredible things for their people and communities. I wanted to hear more of their stories, their teachings, and find out why Indigenous women had been impacted more than Indigenous men. And then my journey began. People were put in my path to help me understand these questions. The elders say there's no such thing as coincidence, and I believe that because I would meet people, I would be in meetings, I would find myself in places where this topic or this conversation would come up. One of the first books that I read about the power of Indigenous women contained this Cheyenne proverb about the strength of women. And it's true. We are the heart strength of our families and nations. And we need to remember that when we do this work and remind people of that, because many forget. And so I've spent, I would say, the past 20, 25 years trying to revitalize women's roles, place in relation to laws, legal orders, and governance. And this is the work that I do now. So I want to transition now into framing this presentation from the perspective that there are multiple understandings of restorative justice. But if I can be blunt, the origins of the practice originates in practices of Indigenous peoples' processes to restore, maintain, and facilitate balance and harmony within our families and within our communities. I want to start from that place because it brings me to a conversation I was having with one of my friends one day, who is also Cree. She works at a big university. I won't say where she works just to respect her anonymity. But she called me up one day, really distraught over a meeting that was taking place on campus about this very topic that we are discussing over the next couple days. restorative justice. She went on to tell me that it was predominantly non-Indigenous white people who were organizing the meeting and setting the protocols for the meeting. In our conversation, she was really blunt with me and said, Janice, I feel really uncomfortable about this. And I'm trying to articulate why, but I can't right now. This just doesn't feel right. We continued our conversation and we landed on the theme of Indigenous practices, protocols, and ideas around restoring balance being co opted without any acknowledgement or recognition being made to the origins of these practices and where they come from. And I don't say this to be disrespectful. I'm saying this because these are real conversations that are happening in these spaces around this topic. And we need to be aware and mindful that this is happening and to just give space and respect and acknowledgement where it needs to come from. So, in preparing to present to you today, I wanted to find research on this topic, and I landed on some of the work of former federal court judge Justice Mundaman, who is Anishinaabe and he lives in Amiskwichi, Waskagan, otherwise known as Edmonton. In his thesis, he provides an overview of the different understandings of restorative justice. And what was striking to me was the evolution of where restorative justice stems from coming up with a practice process that facilitates healing, participation, taking responsibility, recognizing harm caused to individuals, families, and community. These are all elements that existed within Indigenous law and governance practices before the invasion of colonial laws into our lives. This tells me that the criminal justice system is not working, and we know that. In fact, one of my friends and colleagues, Haudenosaunee law professor Bev Jacobs, who's done a lot of work with and around Indigenous women, she always corrects me and says, Janice, it's not the criminal justice system. There is no justice in that system. It's the criminal law and legal system. So, helping me to reframe how I think about this. If these principles already existed then, why are we not spending more time revitalizing and restoring the laws and governance practices that our ancestors lived by? And this is where I want to spend my time with you this morning, talking about these things. I want to share just briefly a story of how I came to learn and know what our laws are. And the graphic that you see on the slide here is something that was shared with me and taught to me by my mom when I was like, I want to say an early teen. And it's a very simple teaching, but these are the foundational laws, what we refer to as Cree or natural laws, that every child that is born into a Cree nation would have been taught. And these are laws of honesty, which is represented by the tree, the law of sharing, which is symbolized by animals, the law of strength and determination. So that is the prayer part of who we are, and kindness and caring, which is symbolized by the sweetgrass. So when the elder was doing the prayer in the smudge this morning, that is practicing part of the laws that are the foundational aspects of what grounds us and ties us to an everyday practice to stay grounded and balanced, but also the physical reminders of where we're born into. So these were things that were taught to me as a child. And so when I started to unpack and think about this concept of restorative justice, I think we were having a conversation with Margarita and Neka, and I just said, we don't call it. I mean, yes, we refer to it as restorative justice, but in our community, in our worldview, and in our philosophies, this is just our way of life. And these are the teachings that were given to us by the Creator to live by, or some people refer to them as our original instructions. And these are the foundational laws, teachings, and principles that help make us live a good life, to be good human beings. And so these are the checks and balances that we have been taught since as children. And so when my mom and my parents taught this to my brother and I, they also did it alongside encouraging us to go to ceremonies. And I remember the first ceremony that I think I was really curious about watching my mom, because um, at my uncle's house every summer, he would have and host, actually, my late grandfather, he would have and host what we call fast ceremonies. And this is where people go out on the land for 4 days and 4 nights without food and water, and you reflect on your life. And it's a time of reflection. What am I doing right? What can I improve upon? And how do I become a better person? And so it was at this time, like I would go on the fasting grounds and I would see my mom out on the land in this kind of little hut that we create. It's like a mini sweat. And I would walk out on the grounds and I would look at my mom and I'm like, what is my mom doing? Why is she doing that? And later on, my aunties would teach me about the significance and symbolism in doing that. And it was to learn how to be a good human being, to learn what our purpose in life is. And so that then became the point of contact for me in really understanding and conceptualizing what I think many people would refer to as the basic foundational principles of these elements that we're trying to facilitate through restorative justice practices, in how to create balance, get back to balance, create the harmony that has been, our lives have been disrupted by. So not long after that, I started to do work with elders. And I remember this one time walking into Blue Quills University, it's called now, but it back then it was Blue Quills First Nations College, and it was a residential school prior to that. And this was where I was having these questions of, where are the women? What are the women's roles? Why are the women's more oppressed than the men? Like, how do I answer the questions? Where are the answers to these questions that I'm having? And how do we understand governance and laws and self-determination? So I was having all these questions, and it really stemmed from sitting on the land for 4 days and thinking about life and trying to figure out like the answers to the question, what is my purpose? What is the purpose of life? Like, what are the answers to these questions that I'm having? And I walked into the office of Elder George Britton, who you see on the screen here, one day with my protocol tobacco and print, because that's when we have questions we want to ask elders, we approach them with the proper protocol. And I was really naive back then. And I was expecting him to answer my questions right on the spot. And all he gave me back in my response, in my questions to him, it was very blunt, short. He just said, Newsom, granddaughter, you need to go back to the beginning. And that's all he said to me. And for the longest time, I had to think about, what is he talking about? Go back to the beginning. And in this moment, like, I had the realization, like, I really know nothing because I don't know what he's talking about. Why can't he just tell me what our governance is? Why can't he just tell me what self-determination is and what our laws are in Cree? But what he did in that moment was give me a teaching that forced me to unpack all of these things and to begin to ask more questions. And that set me on a path of meeting other elders, asking more questions about where, like, what is the purpose of our ceremonies? Again, where are the women? And that turned me to do research in the area of looking at conceptualizing how do we understand what self-determination is from a Cree lens or a Cree worldview. And when we talk about restorative justice, it's about the order, restoring the order that was lost, stripped away, or taken. And so, when in the course of working with the elders that I was privileged to learn from, what they talked about was this idea of a Yinu Paminsuin in Cree, and to translate that and to unpack that, my auntie translated that for me to mean this is how order and organization were given to our people. And the element that kind of kept us together in the practice of this was the ceremonies. And so when we start to think about how the ceremonies were taken away from us because of things like the Indian Act, making it illegal for us to gather and practice, um, like the sun dances were directly targeted. The potlatch was for people on the West Coast. They sent the Canadian government essentially stripped us of our ability to have and practice the sophisticated governance and legal structures that were naturally embedded into our communities that kept the order and organization, which kept the balance and harmony and peace and safety of our people. So, this is why I spend so much time talking about these things, because my belief is that when we restore, revitalize, and recover the laws that were intentionally attacked through Canadian colonial laws, then we will begin to uncover and recover the things that um, were lost and taken away. And part of that process is starting with the question of asking, who am I and what is my purpose? And in Cree worldview, we're taught about this concept called Miopaminsuin or Miopamatsuin, the good life. And in Anishinaabe, I think you guys say it as Mino Bimatsuin. It's this concept of living the good life or a good life. And within this word is embedded a whole philosophical understanding of coming to terms with who are you? Who am I? Who are we? And what is my identity? What is the reason and purpose that I was sent here from the Creator? And what are my original instructions? And what are the laws that were given to us? And those laws that were given to us very specifically for a purpose to live in peace, in harmony, to do no harm with our fellow human and non-human relatives. And we teach our children these things because we want our children to know and recognize that we not only have human relationships and kinships and a responsibility to those, but we also have a responsibility to the non human relationships that we are in relation with by being born into the nation and the clans and tied to the land base that we come from. And so it's the law, our identity is tied to our ceremonies, that is our governance. We practice that out on the land. Our relationships with people and non humans keep us relationally accountable. And then we practice this relationship through the ceremonial governance that we have to practice every aspect of different parts of the year. So there's ceremonies that happen at different parts of the year. And this is what our elders and people refer to as the natural laws of life. Like the sun comes up every day. If the sun doesn't come up, then the sun is not practicing the law of the sun. And so these are things that are naturally embedded within the practice and philosophy of who we are as Indigenous people. And the questions of what is my purpose? What is your purpose? What is our purpose? And what is the purpose of life? And why are we here? These are life questions that help us connect to our identity. And within Indigenous laws and legal orders, we don't we don't have the same concept of laws the way that Canadian common law, civil law does, the criminal justice system. Our laws come through and within through things like our creation stories, other teachings, and these are taught to us as children. And because of the disruption or invasion into our families, the breaking of the family structure, this practice has been impacted. Every Indigenous child would have learned and know their creation story and creation stories, because that is where these elements of what our purpose is and the laws and the governance gets taught to us. And the one that I was taught, and I don't have the time to share it, but I'm just going to give you a very high level version of this because this is the one that I was taught. And it's about this child referred to as Eagle Child. And the story is the Eagle Child story. And the whole purpose of this story is to teach us about life and how when we are born into our families and nations, um, our parents, the mothers mostly take on this role. They have very specific instructions of how to raise children. And this is again embedded in our laws and governance. And in this story, it's at the time of the dinosaurs when the dinosaurs were invading the land and human beings were not following the laws that we were given. So we were being punished. And this child was born into this community, and the dinosaurs took over. The child was put in a rock, and the mom and everybody was killed in that village. And the story is about the growth of this child and the journey of this child going to all of the cardinal directions, the east, the south, the west, and the north, and asking in every direction, what is my purpose? And in every direction, that grandmother, grandfather spirit responded, giving him a little bit of information. And at the end, he's given all of these sacred instruments that we have and use today, and medicines, the drum, the rattle, um, the sweat lodge, and the medicines that we use. And this journey that Eagle Child is on, it's to ask the questions of, am I making the right decision? Am I on the right path? And at the end, he's given all of his original instructions and the laws and how and the sacred instruments and how to live a good life, how to live Mio Pamatsuin, the good life. And this is where, when we know all of these things and we're connected to our Indigenous identity, we know our purpose and there's no disconnection, where we know the instructions of why we came here, what our purpose is, and we live our life according to that. What has happened is the invasion of colonial laws into our families, into our laws, and into our governance. And that is where the disruption and the disharmony comes from. And so this is where we have things like what Leroy Little Bear refers to as these jagged worldviews colliding. And he says, how we come to know, understand, and live in the world impacts our view of justice, restoring balance, and healing harms inflicted. Challenging colonialism means considering the multi sources of worldviews, philosophies that contain a society's laws, governance, and justice narratives. Decolonization challenges us to consider the multi sources of laws contained within many Indigenous laws and legal orders that exist on Turtle Island. As Leroy Little Bear states, Aboriginal traditions, laws, and customs are the practical application of the philosophy and values of that group. The values and customs are the participatory part of that Aboriginal people play in the maintenance of creation. Law is the culture, and culture is the law. Restoring the balance within an individual and community requires a return to these teachings, laws, and governance structures that instilled values and kept social order within a family and within the community. I briefly want to just talk about the slide that you see on the screen because, um, and this was done by my late grandfather, Mike Steinhauer, in, I want to say, the 80s, 90s, shortly after coming out of this period of being very oppressed by what happened in the residential schools. And that generation of people within our community, within our families, taking on the healing movement to heal from the impacts of what they went through in residential school. And so when they started to come out of the, I'll say, the residential school haze, and recognizing and realizing that what happened there was um, just an awful experience, and the violence that they experienced then became transmitted onto their children and families and successive generations. In that healing moment, there was a recognition that this is not how our people lived. This is not how we parented. This is not what happened in our families. This is not what happened in our communities. And so they began to uncover these teachings. Well, how did things happen traditionally? And what are the impacts of this? And this is where my Musa, my Uncle Vince, created this graphic in our community, in our area, to try and exemplify and demonstrate that if we were practicing our way of life before there was colonial invasion and disruption that created the imbalance, our children and elders would be at the center, and the women, the clan mothers, would be surrounding that. And that would address the issues of violence that we see inflicted directed towards women. And we would begin to develop and implement this inner circle that's green to replace what has been imposed upon us on the outer circle. So, for example, the medicine people that had very specific roles, they were replaced by the hospitals and the current Canadian healthcare system. So when we're talking about rebalancing and restoring balance, it's going back to the old ways, which were what kept us healthy and addressed all of the harm and imbalance that would have existed had it not been for the imposition of colonial laws. And so I just want to talk about some of the proactive and prevention strategies that exist in this idea of thinking about kinship as law and law as lived, and that restorative justice is not just like a very narrow source of practice. It's learning about the laws to live a good way of life, and that kinship is multi-directional. It implies a reciprocal relationship. And when we know what that is, there is that relational accountability that gets automatically embedded in the practice. So when we're in relationship with people and non-human beings, we know that there's this automatic response to be responsible to that relationship and to care and to do no harm. So on the um, topic of how restorative justice, Indigenous law, and legal traditions converge, I wanted to bring in the work of Horn and Chartrand, who've done some work to develop a report on this relationship. So they say Indigenous legal traditions are distinct and separate from restorative justice practices, that Indigenous laws and structures are tied to an expansive kinship network that is interrelated. Indigenous law and legal traditions kept the balance. It addressed the harms caused holistically, and ensured kinship networks were maintained according to these ancient practices or original instructions that I talked about. Restorative justice practices shouldn't further colonize individuals through Western legal systems and processes created to address harms caused by individuals. So these are some things that they talk about in this report that they've compiled to look at the similarities and the differences between the three of these things. I don't want to go through every aspect of this slide, but I put it together for you to see the difference between how state-based justice conceptualizes dealing with issues, how Indigenous justice achieves that, and how restorative justice. So if I were to pick one, um, in the Canadian justice system, it's the concept that justice is seen to be addressing fairness. However, in Indigenous justice practices, we think about the holistic well-being and interconnectedness of the individual, the people, the community, and those affected. Under restorative justice practices, this is a process and approach to deal with harm. So I put this on here so that you can see the differences and how they may relate or not relate, or how instances of specific situations that arise within for an individual, for a family, for a community may use or not use different aspects of this. So this comes from a report that looks at what is happening in Saskatchewan and British Columbia. I just want to highlight very quickly some of the work of Cree ethicist Willie Ermine. He wrote an article called Ethical Space. And this concept that he created, I think, is can be used and applied in some of the work in relation to coming to an understanding of recognizing the differences, the convergences, the similarities around Indigenous laws, Indigenous knowledge systems, governance, and also restorative justice. So, in this concept of ethical space, he says that there's a space that gets created, which he refers to as the ethical space, when two societies with completely different worldviews are posed to have to interact and engage with each other. And this ethical space of engagement proposes a framework as a way of examining the diversity and positioning of Indigenous peoples and Western society. And so I submit to you that in the work that we do, that we think about in relation to how we practice restorative justice, or thinking about more transformative justice models to um, unpack and decolonize some of these practices, that we have to engage at this level of ethical space to understand each other. And only when we do that can we really understand what is happening on both sides of this relationship. I'm very aware and mindful of the time. Um, but what I wanted to do, just highlight briefly on this slide, is that I want folks to see the level of sophistication that exists within our laws and legal orders and governance. So, what you see on the screen is just a very high level example of Cree laws and legal orders and the framework that I've been taught from the elders, but also my colleague and friend Sylvia McAdam captures in the only book that exists out there that talks about Cree laws in her book Nationhood Interrupted. And I already talked about how the creator gave us our laws. So we say, Kesemantu Otawingiuna. That is the creator gave us the laws, our original instructions. Wasakichak is the being that brought the laws to the people. And it was the women, the Okechetauskawak in Cree that translates to the warrior women or the clan mothers, they were given the role to carry the laws as the law keepers. Their role would be similar to the Supreme Court judges. So you can see that there was incredible disruption in our families, in our laws, and our legal order structures that didn't continue this practice after the Indian Act was introduced into our families and communities. Because had there not been disruption, every child that was born into a Cree family and Cree nation would know all these laws. So we have our Cree laws, which are they're based on Mother Earth. There's animal laws, there's human laws, and there's spiritual laws. And within each one of these aspects, there's a whole branch of laws that fall under that. And when we break this law, at the beginning, I talked about how my family keeps me accountable. We refer to this as stepping over or creating a pastahuan. We are stepping over the laws, and there's repercussions that come with that. So, how we address that, we have practices like restorative justice. Um, I talked about the ethical space, but also we have our own remedies within our own nations of how we fix the law that's broken, whether that's with and among each other or with animals, with the land. And I'm sharing this with you because this is the level of sophistication that exists and existed within um, Indigenous laws and legal orders. I'm only talking about Cree laws here. Anishinaabe people, Haudenosaunee people, West Coast people, Dene people, every Indigenous nation across this country had laws of this level of sophistication that kept balance within their community. And it was with the introduction of colonial laws that invaded and disrupted this. And this is why the work that I focus on now is around reclaiming and revitalizing the laws. Because when we do that, we address the disharmony, the imbalance, and we restore the roles that the women had so that we do not have to talk about or have to think about gender-based violence. Because if we had these laws restored and practiced within our families and communities, gender-based violence would be non-existent. Because when you think about the roles of for example, the Okechetauskawak or the clan mothers and the warrior women, they had the same level of authority and power and strength as judges. And when laws were broken, they were the ones that corrected it. But now, because of the disruption in our families and the community, because of colonial laws, we have to revitalize that. We have to restore this so that balance can come back, so that we get to the place where the governance structure that I talked about is in balance again. And this is where the work of revitalizing laws legal orders, and governance plays such a pivotal role. And I think restorative justice is just one part of that. And I want to now just quickly transition into talking about Indigenous women and why Indigenous women are so vocal and mobilize around the issue of gender-based violence, and talk about this in a way that articulates the roots of the violence we experience as coming from the introduction of colonial laws and the colonial violence intentionally created to through like things like domination, dehumanization, racism, discrimination, and all that being brought to our shores through things like the doctrine of discovery, because it was legal instruments that came from the papal bulls, which created the doctrine of discovery, that looked at indigenous peoples as subhuman beings. And so this is what we're trying to undo, is look at where the patriarchy was introduced, how misogyny became introduced into our families, our nations, and governance, and be able to decolonize these things so that Indigenous women, girls, our two spirit relatives do not have to experience things like the gender based violence that they experience in their lives. And so the dismantling of colonial laws and systems and coming to terms with that is a part of how we do that. And I just want to quickly bring us back to um, restoring the whole person and why it's incredibly important that we look at that, and that when we think about restorative justice, we're also thinking about the impacts of historic and intergenerational trauma on the lives of people. Because when you introduce foreign laws into a family, a community, you are disrupting that whole system of harmony that existed. And part of looking at restorative justice and getting to healing, to intergenerational healing, is to look at the legacy of residential schools and how this has created shame. It's the origins of many of the social problems that we have today, but with appropriate interventions and strategies that reflect all of the things that I'm talking about, the revitalization of our laws, our teachings, being culturally and trauma informed, helps us get to the core issue of addressing this. So I just want to thank you. Thank you for your time. Um, I hope that I didn't speak too fast, and I hope that I planted some seeds of thinking about these issues and this topic in a different way.
Janice, thank you so much, Janice. You're seeing the chat. It's People are saying thank you so much, Janice, for your presentation. The way you were really able to share the stories, the journey, and introducing us to the laws and the legal frameworks that have always existed, as you said, to help us understand the rich Indigenous lens that informs restorative justice. Thank you so much, Janice. We're going to move into our Q&A now, Janice. So I'm just going to ask Jade, if you don't mind putting down the slides. So Janice, it'll just be you and I here so that I can, I'm just taking a moment to see all of the feedback you're getting, Janice, as well in the chat. It's getting busy. Um, Thank you so much, Janice. We have a little bit of time here where we can move into our Q&A, and folks have been submitting their questions, and we continue to encourage you to please submit your questions for Janice, and I'll move us right along. Janice, how does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you.
Great. So there's a question here that's related to one of the quotes that you shared on the screen. A nation is not conquered until the hearts of its women are on the ground. Then it is done, no matter how brave its warriors or strong its weapons. The person shares, "This quote is so powerful. Could you please explain it once more? Its meaning."
Yeah, I think why I included that, and I included that in the master's research that I did around Indigenous women, because it was through that whole learning process for myself that the elders really helped me understand the power and strength that women have. And I think when we talk about gender-based violence, it sometimes can feel defeating. It can feel like, how are we going to overcome all of the violence that we experience, that we see, that we're trying to overcome? But when you learn about the role, the strength, and power of the women in our own societies and governance structures, you see that the women held and have very prominent roles, that they are the law keepers, that they organize the governance, and that they can correct people. And so that's why I spend a lot of time trying to, by no means am I an expert in this area, but I try and I spend a lot of time trying to learn and elevate the voices of women so that we so that other women and we can recognize and see the strength and power that we had before there was colonial disruption into our families and our nations.
That's so powerful, Janice. You'll have a moment later, maybe when you can review the chat as well. I think it's really resonating for people and part of your presentation. Another question that came in is is I'm going to read it out loud. Is the unique and all-encompassing frameworks of Indigenous laws and legal traditions due to the ways in which Indigenous worldviews disconnect with colonialist capitalist relations and commodification of life based on capital? They're asking for some clarification around, for our nations to live, capitalism must die.
Can you just rephrase that question again? Sorry.
Sure.
Part of it.
Sure. So the question here is this unique and all-encompassing frameworks of Indigenous laws and legal traditions due to the ways in which Indigenous worldviews disconnect with colonialist capital relations and hence commodification of life based on capital. They're asking, about this clarification around this idea.
I don't, and I think it's not just an idea, it's a way of life. And I think that's the difference is capitalism is an ideology. Like consumerism is like an ideology. Indigenous worldview is not just an idea or philosophy or a set of rules and principles. It's a way of life that we were given by the creator to live, to be in relation to not just human beings, but to our non-human relatives, the animals. And this is embedded within like our pipe teachings, our connection to the land. And I think that's the difference is when you see the land and non-human beings as your relatives, it's just a different way of experiencing and seeing the world.
Thank you, Janice. There's a question here as well from the audience. An audience member says that they see warrior women returning in their communities and that it's beautiful. How do we encourage or invite, in their language, our beautiful male energies back to the circle to take place in part of this work?
I think it's just starting to talk to other women and organizing and having women's groups. That's the start of it. And then inviting like the older women, the elders that carry some of the knowledge, the teachings, and maybe the ceremonies into that circle and just asking the questions that I started out asking, like, what role did women have in our governance? What what was our where was our place there? And when you just start to ask simple questions like that, it just uncovers a whole other area of learning that takes you on a whole other realm of talking to people that come in your path.
Thank you, Janice. You have a few questions coming here. Um, there's a question here that says, do you have any tips in educating, informing folks in institutional Western culture and power who choose to disregard knowledge based in generational knowledge? For example,
Um,
when wanting to incorporate, oh, sorry, there's
no,
just
go ahead.
there was like a prompt here. So when wanting to incorporate these messages and learning and teachings from Indigenous leaders and elders, but are asked only to incorporate, quote, evidence-based practices, let me know if you want me to repeat any questions as well.
No, it's okay. I think the easiest way to get to people in helping them understand what I'm talking about is to come to ceremony. It's hard for me to talk about, I can talk about these things and you can see the visual graphics, but it doesn't make sense unless you're part of the family of coming together to participate, to be there, to learn, to help build the lodge, to sit there, to see, to experience that women own half the lodge, the men own half the lodge, the men serve the women in our ceremonies. And to see that is like so beautiful, profound, and impactful. I think sometimes we have to get out of our heads. We have to move into our hearts and to experience that for ourselves.
Thank
And
you,
there are
Janice.
instances, I'm looking at somebody asking, where can we participate in ceremonies
Yes,
and non-Indigenous people? I want to say that inclusive within our laws and our original instructions, we have teachings and prophecies that talk about the different families of the world. And my auntie Diane, who is online listening and watching, has taught me and my mom about this. And so when we talk about families, I'm talking about like the in the medicine wheel, like the red, the white, the black, the yellow, and that's inclusive of everybody around the world and the families that we have. And part of the learning that we're supposed to do is to learn from each other, but we haven't done that. And because we haven't done that, this is why we have all of these issues. But like where we're at, there are non-Indigenous people that come and listen, learn, and practice. And I can tell you that when they do, they become like our strongest allies. And they do so in a respectful way, in a way that was intended, like the treaty relationship intended for us to have this relationship with each other.
wow, thank you. Thank you, Janice. And following up on that message that you saw come through in the chat, there's also a question here in terms of someone wanting some further clarity. Is it fair to say that the current criminal legal system is not a space that is conducive of practicing a way of life that actually helps address and stop a lot of the violence, including gender-based violence, that is happening because of settler colonial disruptions and practices?
Yeah, I would say the criminal legal system is it it doesn't even serve the purpose I think that it was originally intended, set up by the Canadian laws, and it does nothing to help people um, think about the harms that were caused to the people that they have hurt or harmed. I think that we need to just decolonize, abolish it, think about other forms of justice, which I think my friend and colleague NECA and other folks are going to talk about tomorrow, because these systems are just not working. And they're creating and facilitating and perpetuating more violence than anything. And we need to um, think about other ways. And the powers in the people. And we have to think about how do we create a revolution to of healing, love, justice that's based in all of these other things.
Thank you, Janice. Yeah, t today, you're starting this conversation with us today, and after there'll be a panel as well, practitioners talking about restorative justice, and tomorrow as well. You're right. There's a um, there's a question here that says, do you think restorative justice is an approach or practice that is possible outside of holistic Indigenous way of life? To give some context, the person says, we see GBV spaces talking about incorporating restorative justice practices into non-Indigenous organizations or systems, and it can feel like co-opting. For example, offering restorative conversations for GBV victims and perpetrators instead of incarceration. Do you have some thoughts on that, Janice?
Yeah, I think when I was sharing the story earlier at the beginning, when I had the conversation with my friend who called me distraught about the co-optation of some of the work, the process, I I think that the whole restorative justice work is important, but we have to be aware, mindful, and cautious in how we approach it and just acknowledge where it comes from. And I think maybe most people don't realize and recognize that the origins of the practices and the processes that are naturally embedded within that is coming from indigenous laws and legal orders and governance structures that predated Canada. And it's just as simple as recognizing that this is the origins of where it comes from. We know that the colonial systems and the criminal justice system doesn't work. And so, how can we revamp, or how do we revolutionize this practice and process so that we're not creating more harm by using things that are found in a colonial system that is just intended to facilitate more violence?
Thank you, Janice. You can see people are also resonating with your response. Um, There's also we have time, Janice, if it's okay, maybe about one or two more questions before we would be leading into the break. Um, so there's also a question here about, um, you know, finding, some of the work that you had said here in your talk about that they found it very impactful to hear you say that, if we were to follow the traditional Cree teachings, the purpose and the laws, that there would be no gender-based violence. It's so profound and telling, says this person. How would you propose maybe reframing justice to survivors of sexual assault or gender-based violence who don't get to see justice through a court system?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question, but really important. Um, and there are instances I know where, like, people who experience like intimate partner gender-based violence don't feel safe in being in the same room as the person that committed the harm, the violence. And so those are instances I think where we need to center the the safety the wishes of the person. And I think that there was somebody else in the chat that was talking about how do we teach men. And I think this relates to that question is we're spending a lot of time educating and talking with and amongst ourselves as women. The men need to learn and unlearn these things that I'm talking about as well. And I think when we do that, we will see a change and switch in some of the different types of violence to more harmony based practice. And it's not to minimize the violence. I just think that we don't spend enough time like decolonizing or teaching the male parts of this relationship that exists.
Yeah, and Janice, actually, there's a few questions that were related in the chat, but also coming through in the Q&A, right? Opportunities to engage men and boys in this work as well. Um, I think we'll have time for one more question, Janice. Um, so there is another question again. There's about the idea of introducing restorative justice. So regarding working through, for example, an ethical space, in addition to having decision-making conversation with people whose cultures were extensively borrowed from for the purpose of a Western understanding of restorative justice, what are other steps or practices that can be made to create an ethical space?
I think how the elder introduced us this morning, we naturally started with an ethical space. And it's not seeing it as something that's complicated. It's seeing it as something as how do we create safe space that acknowledges that there are multiple potentially divergent worldviews that exist in a conversation, but we set the protocols of what that conversation will look like. And you talked about it at the beginning. Like you set the ethical space for us today of what the protocols of what the expectations of how we are going to engage and interact online. I think it's that simple. I mean, and it's not meant to simplify the work, but it's we recognize that there's going to be people that have all kinds of thoughts, ideas, differing opinions, worldviews, and it's just facilitating and creating a safe, respectful space where we can listen and learn from one another so that after we learn something, like hopefully somebody out of over 1,000 of you walked away learning one thing today. And that, if you did that, then I did my job. And you go out into the world and you're a better person for it. And you can practice kindness, love, compassion, empathy in your interactions with other people. And it's just that it's how we treat other people too.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you so much. Everyone, you'll have an opportunity to see the feedback, but you were able to walk us through a presentation in such a clear way, sharing the stories, the journey. Thank you so much, Janice, for your presentation, and for being here with us today. We're so grateful.